Are there any statements? I call the member for Balcombe Hills.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. Tonight, Mr Acting Speaker, I rise on a very solemn matter, a matter that will get much discussion over the course of the next 2 or 3 days as we draw close to the the anniversary of the signing of the armistice of 1918, an armistice that was signed bringing the end to the Great War, the First World War, the war which Australia was bloodied, the war which Australia grew and identified itself as a nation. Mr Acting Speaker, it is some regret that I have to stand here before the House and express the views expressed to me by many of the sub-branch of the Castle Hill RSL and the Parramatta RSL. Mr Acting Speaker, so many veterans over the course of the last couple of years have felt that they are out of touch with the government, that the government does not reflect the views of the veterans community. Mr Acting Speaker, I can tell you that as a former Army officer and a former peacekeeper, I am acutely aware of the views that have been expressed by the veterans community right around New South Wales in the recent decision by the National Executive of the RSL and Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd relating to a memorandum of understanding with our former enemies in the Vietnam conflict. Mr Acting Speaker, as any member who has been exposed to conflict resolution will testify, forgiveness and reconciliation are very personal acts. No one who has been the victim of violence or tragedy can have their feelings dictated to them. Forgiveness cannot be manufactured or imposed, but it must be genuinely felt. For this reason, I was very sympathetic to calls by Vietnam veterans in my electorate to speak out against the draft Entente Cordiale between the Returned Services League of Australia and the Viet Cong. This was a unilateral decision by the National Executive of the RSL and the Minister for Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Kevin Rudd, without any consultation with the veterans community, particularly Vietnam veterans. Our Vietnam veterans are not suggesting that Australia and Vietnam should not have normal and mature bilateral relations. We have enjoyed a positive and beneficial relationship with Vietnam since formal diplomatic relations were established in the 1970s. However, our priority must lie with the well-being of our veterans who still live with the horrors of the Vietnam conflict. Having Australian war veterans in my electorate find out via the media that the very institutions that they have entrusted to act in their best interest have, without consultation, drafted a document enforcing a friendship agreement is just plain wrong. For the memorandum to have any significance for the two former adversaries, it would presumably hold parties to account for their actions. This is where the betrayal begins. As a good proportion of those who fought in the Vietnam War did not volunteer, they had no choice as to whether they agreed with the political genesis of the conflict. They had no voice as to whether or not they would fight. Now these very same men have been denied a voice in the decision to enter a memorandum of understanding. The fact that the Ex-Combatants Association in Vietnam is both state-run and denies South Vietnamese veterans from joining suggests that any agreement entered into by the RSL would concur with the values and the aims of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Australians are very proud of their military heritage, Mr Acting Speaker, and rightly so. However, we did not enter into such agreements with former Nazi combatants, nor with their Imperial Japanese counterparts, yet our relations with Japan and Germany remain strong. Indeed, our generous foreign aid to Vietnam over recent years should highlight the respect we have for our Asian neighbour. But as a liberal democracy, it is appropriate that Australia promotes tolerance and forgiveness on the world stage. As a liberal democracy, it is appropriate that Australia promotes tolerance and forgiveness on the world stage. However, governments cannot presume to force opinions onto individual citizens. After all, wasn't that what the Vietnam conflict was all about? Mr Acting Speaker, I was delighted that since establishing this point with the Vietnamese Veterans Association, the National Executive of the RSL has withdrawn its plan to enter an MOU. So it is with great pleasure that I can say diggers can rest easy this Remembrance Day knowing that we did not forget to remember. Thank you.
The House will now proceed with private member statements.